Chapter 2. Curious Revelation. Nancy wheeled around and caught a fleeting glimpse of a long row of brass buttons down the front of the man's coat. The next instant, the panel closed noiselessly. As Nancy dashed toward the spot, one hand brushed the piano keys. A crash of chords broke the eerie stillness of the cottage. Nancy tried to be calm, but her heart was thumping madly. I mustn't let myself be frightened, she told herself. Deciding it might be dangerous to investigate the cottage further at this time, she hastily left it. Once outside, she gazed about the grounds. No one was in sight. I'm glad Trixie didn't come with me, she said to herself. I've never believed in ghosts, and I refuse to do so now. All the same, there's something very queer about this place. Nancy had inherited an inquiring mind from her father, an eminent criminal lawyer, but she knew the wisdom of using caution in all investigations. Since solving The Secret of the Old Clock, Nancy had built an enviable reputation as an amateur sleuth. Now, as she stood staring at Ship Cottage, Nancy wondered why the piano had made no sound when her fingers had moved over the keys the first time. It wasn't my imagination, she reflected. Just then Nancy heard her name called. Turning, she saw Ellen motioning to her from far up the path. Coming, Nancy answered. I'm ready to leave whenever you are, Ellen announced, joining her new friend. What became of Trixie? She ran off. You know, Ellen, I rather like her, Nancy declared with sincerity. Mrs. Chatham speaks so harshly to her daughter, Ellen remarked. Then the next minute she's as sweet as honey. I can't understand her. You've decided not to take the position for the summer? I told Mrs. Chatham I'd think it over. Nancy said slowly, There's something about Rocky Edge I don't quite like. Ellen, I wish you wouldn't come here. At least not until we've made a complete investigation of the place. Why, Nancy, Ellen exclaimed in astonishment. Have you learned something about Mrs. Chatham? Not a thing, Nancy answered. It's mostly a feeling I have. I'll explain it later. When must you give her your answer? Mrs. Chatham didn't say, but I imagine she wants to know soon. During the ride back to River Heights, Ellen sensed that Nancy was keeping something from her and asked if this was true. Smiling, Nancy refused to divulge what she had learned. I'll tell my secret when you tell yours, she joked. But seriously, please don't accept Mrs. Chatham's offer until after I talk with my dad. All right, I won't, Ellen promised. Nancy drove the girl to a bus which would take her back to Blackstone College, then went to her father's office. Nancy frequently asked his assistance in solving mysteries. Although Mr. Drew was unusually busy, the tall, handsome man laid aside his papers, kissed his daughter affectionately, and listened attentively to her story about the mysterious Ship Cottage. You're certain you saw the open panel close again? He asked when she had finished. Yes, Dad. Also, the piano was mute at first. Then later it played. How do you account for that? I can't, the lawyer replied soberly. However, I think it would be unwise for you to go there again. Oh, Dad, Nancy protested in dismay. How can I help Ellen if I don't? Well, don't go alone, he amended, flashing her an understanding smile. You're all I have, Nancy. You're very dear to me. Don't forget that. She hugged him and promised, then asked, Do you think it would be unwise for Ellen to accept Mrs. Chatham's offer? I'd say it would be foolhardy until we've checked the place thoroughly. I had hoped you might be able to tell me something about Rocky Edge, Dad. Mr. Drew gazed out the window for several seconds. Then he said slowly, It seems to me I do recall some trouble a few years ago at Rocky Edge. But that would have been before the Chathams bought it. Who owned it previously? Nancy asked. I can't remember the name of the man, her father answered. But I think he was an inventor, and there was an unusual lawsuit against him, due to one of his gadgets. As soon as I can, I'll look into the matter for you. I wonder if there might be some connection between the gadgets and the strange things that happened today, Nancy remarked. I don't know. It seems to me Mr. Chatham was a friend of the owner and bought the place after the man died. Mr. Chatham himself passed away less than 2 years ago." Nancy was silent for a moment, then asked her father what she should tell Ellen. "Advise her to stall," Carson Drew answered promptly. Nancy decided that instead of telephoning Ellen, she would drive to Blackstone College the next afternoon. Ellen was to be in a recital, and Nancy was eager to hear her sing. She invited her friends Bess Marvin and George Fain to go with her, and they accepted. The two girls, who were cousins, often shared Nancy's adventures. Bess, blonde and slightly plump, was a bit more timid than slim, tomboyish George. "Uh-oh," Bess remarked as the three entered the college auditorium. "Nearly all the seats are taken." "We'll squeeze in somewhere," Nancy declared cheerfully. "I see 2 places down front where the performers are seated." She suggested that Bess and George go forward and take them. "I'll sit somewhere else. Introduce yourselves to Ellen Smith after the recital and tell her I'm here. We'll meet in the lobby." As Nancy looked for a seat, she saw Mrs. Chatham, half hidden behind an enormous hat, near the rear of the auditorium. There was an empty chair beside the woman. Nancy made her way to it. "Are you saving this seat, Mrs. Chatham?" she asked, smiling. The woman shook her head. The next moment, recognizing the newcomer, she beamed at Nancy as if they were old friends. Thus encouraged, Nancy began a conversation which she adroitly steered to a discussion of Rocky Edge. The widow mentioned its previous owner, Silas Norse. "He must have been an interesting person. We've found several ingenious gadgets of his in the house," she said lightly. Nancy casually mentioned her visit to Ship Cottage, but did not refer to the secret panel or the man she had seen. She merely inquired if Mr. Chatham had collected the ship models. "Oh dear, no. They belonged to my first husband," Mrs. Chatham said with a pensive sigh. "He was such a good, kind man. It made me so sad to see those darling little boats in the house that I asked Mr. Chatham to move them to the studio." "Do you go out there frequently?" Nancy queried. "To the studio, I mean." "Almost never." "I suppose it was built by your late husband?" "No," the widow replied. "It was on the property when we took over the place. I judge it has been there for some time." Nancy would have asked additional questions, but just then the orchestra began to play. For an hour and a half she enjoyed the recital and was proud of Ellen Smith, whose vocal solos were the best numbers on the program and received the most applause. "Do come and see me sometime," Mrs. Chatham invited Nancy as she rose to leave. "I'd love to," Nancy answered. "I'll try to drive to Rocky Edge within the next few days." Just then, Bess, George, and Ellen came up the aisle of the auditorium. "Oh, Nancy," Ellen exclaimed, "we've been looking everywhere for you." She paused, slightly embarrassed to find herself face to face with Mrs. Chatham. "My dear, your singing was marvelous," the widow gushed. "I had no idea you were so talented. I'll be happy to have you teach music to my Trixie. You are accepting the position." Ellen glanced at Nancy, seeking a cue to the proper response. I don't know what to say," she stammered nervously. "I want to think it over." "I must know at once," Mrs. Chatham insisted. End of chapter 2.